All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shawn, and today I'll be talking about my PhD dissertation work at UCLA. My advisor is Walter Gackerman, and then we did this at the Large Plasma Device. So this is the device shown here. I'd like to acknowledge the US Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation for funding this project. And so today I'll be talking about an experimental observation of a field-aligned ion beam that's produced by magnetic reconnection. And this is on 2 flux ropes on the Large Plasma Device. Okay, so an overview of my research. So I'm looking at magnetic flux ropes. So essentially, by definition, they are current carrying boundary surface that encloses a constant magnetic flux. So essentially, if you have a current, we have a cartoon right here. If you have a current that's flowing in the z direction, you get a poloidal magnetic field that varies radially. But in our experiment in the LAPD, we also have a guide field that is also in the z direction. So this combined with the poloidal magnetic field gives a helical field as shown. So we know that the kink instability drives magnetic reconnection. So this is a current-driven instability. We can increase the current through the flux ropes. And so what happens is that the ropes becomes kink unstable. They start to writhe, twist. They may collide with each other. And in the process, magnetic reconnection occurs. Now, it is known that particle heating and acceleration is associated with reconnection. And this has not been studied much. Most studies involve like electrons, and not in the configuration of flux ropes. So for us, what we want to study is we want to study the ion dynamics inside in 2 colliding flux ropes on the Large Plasma Device. So to that end, I constructed an ion retarding field energy analyzer. And then the key result is that we observe an ion beam that's aligned to the background magnetic field. And this magnetic field is considered strong. Okay. So this is an overview of the Large Plasma Device. This is a photo, and then below is the experimental setup. So it is a 26 meter long cylindrical linear device. And to produce a plasma, we have a background plasma cathode and anode shown on the left here. So this there's a lanthanum this cathode is made of lanthanum hexaboride, and it produces plasma produces helium plasma, right? That is about 60 centimeters in diameter. To produce the flux ropes, on the other end of the machine, we have another pair of lanthanum hexaboride cathode. And so when this lanthanum hexaboride cathode discharges, the plasma passes through a mask, a carbon mask that has 2 holes in it. These 2 holes are about 7 centimeters in diameter, and it produces 2 columns of plasma, which is the flux ropes. Now, the flux ropes terminate at the anode that is 11 meters away from the flux rope mask. And unlike Andrew's experiment, this is line tied only on one end. So it's line tied at the mask, and then it's free on the anode. So it's free to oscillate. We have a background magnetic field that's about 330 Gauss. It's uniform throughout the flux ropes. And of course, for my ion energy analyzer, we stick it in somewhere in the middle of the machine. These are typical plasma parameters. I won't go through them. The important thing to note is that for the LAPD, we pulse our plasma. So the rate at which we fire each shot is about 1 hertz. So in 1 second, the experiment's over, and we can repeat this for many different shots in a day. So in a day, you can have about 86,000 shots. The typical discharge cycle is about 15 milliseconds. We turn on the background for 15 milliseconds, and then the flux ropes are turned on in the last 6 milliseconds of the discharge. Okay, so this is experimental data on how the flux ropes look like. This is a very truncated diagram. So the horizontal axis is 9.6 meters, but on the vertical axis is just 7.25 centimeters, which is the size of the flux ropes. These lines right here, they are magnetic field lines. So they are color-coded, and as you can see, the field lines emanate from the source of the ropes, and then they flow into the center of the machine. And as they do so, they kind of mix, and in the center region, you can see that the flux ropes, the field lines are kind of mixed up. So reconnection occurs somewhere in the middle right here. Okay. So now moving on, I'll talk about the ion energy analyzer that I built. So this is a 4-grade retarding field energy analyzer, or RFEA. It has 4 different grades shown here. The entrance grade attenuates the plasma. The repeller grade repels primary electrons from the incoming plasma. The discriminator grid is the grid which we are biasing the different voltages on the RFEA. So the bias on the discriminator grid controls the amount, selects the ions that are able to pass through the grid. So the higher the discriminator grid voltage, the less ions are able to pass, right? And then we have a suppressor grid that repels secondary electrons. So you have very energetic ions that make it past the make it to the collector. Some of them are able to cause surface electrons on the collector to be knocked off just from the high amount of energy the ions have. So to prevent a false reading on the energy analyzer, we have a suppressor grid that prevents electrons from leaving the collector this way. Okay. So in this setup, it's one thing I want to point out is that although we built this as a 4-grid energy analyzer, we found that the best operation is when we connect the entrance grid to the repeller grid. So both of them have a minus 50 volt bias to it. And then the second thing I want to point out is that instead of unlike a typical RFEA where you sweep the voltage from a low to a high potential really quickly, due to a capacitive current that will drown out the signal, we instead choose not to do a sweep, but to keep the voltage constant for each shot. So what we're trying to do is for each shot, we have the voltage constant, and then the next shot, we increase the voltage slightly. And so over the course of maybe a day, you can have multiple collector currents versus the discriminator grid voltage, as I will show. So this is stepped up instead of sweep. Okay, so this is a picture of what the ion energy analyzer looks like. This is the completed probe head. The diameter across this probe is about 1.5 centimeters. At the bottom is an exploded view of what the components of the energy analyzer would look like. We modeled this and then we rendered this using a computer software. Over here is the probe. You can see the full extent of the probe. The probe head is right here. This entire probe shaft is about 1.5 meters. So this enables us to put the probe into the LAPD and make measurements from there. Okay, so what are we interested in measuring? So first, we are going to we collected the collector current, and then we plot that as a function of the discriminator grid bias. So figure A right here is the result of that. As you can see, this is a typical plot of the IV curve, which we're interested in. We have an ion saturation current when the discriminator grid voltage is below the plasma potential. And as you increase the discriminator grid voltage, the current starts to drop because less and less energetic ions get through, and then eventually it drops to 0. Now, why are we doing this? Well, the IV curve gives us an important information, which is the energy content of the ions. So the first thing is that if this IV curve, if the distribution of ions were Maxwellian, then it would be very straightforward. We could just take the slope of this IV curve to get the temperature, and then we would know what the energy content of the ions are. But unfortunately, when we're doing this experiment, we noticed that some of the distribution functions, they are not completely Maxwellian, they're non-Maxwellian. So for example, the IV curve right here is considered a bi-Maxwellian, where you can fit it to a function that is comprised of the sum of 2 Maxwellians, right? And the distribution function is proportional to the derivative of the IV curve as shown. Okay, so I'd like to talk about this quantity known as the average energy. So I'm going to talk about the average energy because I'm going to use it to show the results. So this average energy is the way we quantify the amount of energy. And it is similar to the ion kinetic temperature that some people might call it, but we prefer not to call it a temperature because the term temperature is misleading. And for a non-Maxwellian distribution, the temperature is ill-defined. So so we call this the average energy. And we know that the average energy, right, the ion temperature is proportional to the pressure, and the pressure is related to the second moment of the distribution function right here. And so we define this as the average energy. But then we make some modifications to it. So first, we change variables from velocity to energy. The energy is defined by the kinetic energy. So the energy is proportional to the velocity, the kinetic velocity squared. And second, the energy is also the discriminator grid voltage minus the plasma potential. So this is a change of variables right here. And then the second change that we made is that the RFEA only measures ions that are moving in one direction. So to get the full extent of the average energy along a single axis, we split the integral, and so that it measures the ions, we measure the distribution function in two directions. So the result of all that is that the average energy is defined by this equation right here. And then this n prime is a normalization constant. It can be thought of the density, but it's a normalized density. Okay, so in practice, this is how the distribution function is joined. So you have two measurements right here. This is the IDV, the derivative of the IV curve. So you have two different sides, the RFEA which is facing two different sides, and then we split them at the plasma potential. So we estimate that to be at the peak of the IDV curve. And so you split them, and then we only take the side where the discriminator grid voltage is greater than the plasma potential. And then we do that, we take one side, we define the positive to be we take one direction to be positive. So the plus Z direction, which is towards the background LAP6 cathode, we take it to be positive. And so we split these two IV curves, and then we join them together, and then we normalize them to give this distribution right here, this distribution function right here. Right. Okay, so now we have the distribution function. We can integrate that, and then following our formula of trying to calculate the energy, we can find the average energy as a function of time. So the result of so this is a plot of our experiment. It's a cross section. So this is XY plane, and then you can see these bright circles right here. These are the flux ropes, and then this point A is where we locate the energy analyzer. So at this point, if we plot the average energy as a function of time, you get a result that looks like that. The data points show the spikes, and these spikes occur at the kink frequency. So they follow the kink frequency of the ropes. The points are color-coded. So the way I did this was that I look at the points and I say, okay, if the distribution function is a single Maxwellian, then I'll give it a blue point. And if either side of the distribution function contains a bi-Maxwellian, let's say a bump right here, I would label it as orange, right? And then the reason for doing that is that the bump as a bi-Maxwellian function, it shows us that there is a beam present. So we're interested in this beam that's being produced by the flux rope when they reconnect. So as you can see here, there's a baseline. The blue points that are single Maxwellian, well, when they form a baseline that is about 4 to 8 EV, right? And because a single Maxwellian, it tells us like the ion temperature. So we kind of know that the ion temperature of the flux ropes is about 4 to 8 EV. But when there's a beam present, these orange points right here, we notice that these points tend to be above 8 EV. So by looking at this this plot here, it looks like when there's a beam present, the overall average energy of that point increases, right, for the ions. Okay, so I'm going to show the time evolution of the distribution function. So this is the same plot as we've seen before. And now I focus our attention to this spike right here, which has these points. So at the start, you can see where the average energy is blue. You can see this is a single Maxwellian. But then as time goes by, this peak amplitude starts to drop. And then a second peak develops right here, which is at about 15 EV. Now 15 EV for us is about 3 times the thermal velocity using a 4 EV ion temperature, right? And so as you can see, as time evolves, this peak is persistent. And then after a while, it starts to decrease, and then it goes back to being a single Maxwellian, right? So this is the beam that we observe, and this is the beam that we are kind of interested in. Now, if you compare the distribution function, you notice that the width of the beam is comparable to the primary distribution. We kind of measured that, and then we noticed that the width is kind of comparable, and we know that the width is proportional to the temperature of the population of ions. So that's why we chose to call this the average energy, because we know that the temperature of the ions, they are very similar, right? So it's not the temperature that is increasing, but it's the ions are getting accelerated, and so like the overall kinetic energy of like the system is increasing. Okay, we can take this one step further. So instead of looking at along one direction, which is in the z direction. We can splice the distribution functions along 4 different directions. So over here, we took the distribution functions in the y direction. So the y direction is when you're facing up and down, so at the top and the bottom of the machine. And then we look at a distribution function from there. And then we join the distribution function to the distribution function in the z direction. And so what we get is this kind of polar plot right here. There's only 4 measurements. So this is not meant to be a prediction of what the distribution function is at some arbitrary angle, but rather it's meant to guide the eye as to how this distribution function evolves. So like before, we started off with a single Maxwellian. You can see like it's pretty much a round circle. But as the distribution function evolves, you can see that there's the beam. The beam is right here. You can see there's an island right here, and then there's the primary distribution in the middle. It sort of is pronounced for quite some time, and then it goes back to being a normal distribution function. So from here, we can sort of we can sort of draw a conclusion and say that, okay, the beam is propagating in the plus z direction, mostly in the plus z direction, and that direction happens to be the direction of the background field. So we can say that it is a background field aligned. Okay. Then the next thing we can do is we can compare the distribution function at 2 different locations. So point A is the point that I showed previously, and then point B is a different point. So point A is near the reconnection region in between the 2 ropes, and then B is at a region at the edge of the ropes. And then we do the same thing. We look at the plot of the average energy as a function of time. And so we see that for this average energy as a function of time for near the reconnection region is the one that you have seen before. And then for the bottom one is the one for the edge of the ropes. And as you can see, for the edge of the ropes, the points that are in orange, which indicate the presence of beam, they occur less frequently as compared to when it's near the reconnection region. There's a point here in B where you can see that there's a spike with some bi-Maxwellian distributions. This occurs because as the ropes rotate, at 13 milliseconds, the ropes passes by this point B right here. So as the ropes rotate, it passes by point B, and so you can see there's a spike here. But overall, this result, we can sort of say that, okay, the beam is energized when it's close to the reconnection region, right? And so this gives us a sense of what is necessary to energize this beam. All right. So we talked about the beam in relation to magnetic reconnection. So one way to look at it directly is to look at the correlation with the magnetic field. So now we repeat the experiment, and then we look at magnetic field data. So this is a different experiment taken at a different time. So the plot looks different, but the gist is the same. We look at the average energy as a function of time for a point near the reconnection region, and then most of them produce spikes. You can see these orange colored points right here. There are beams being produced at the later part of this time, at the later part of this cycle. And then we can see this is the B dot probe that was placed at the same point, but along the same axis. And as you can see, the B dot, the magnetic field signal is highly correlated with the average energy of the signal. So it is very highly correlated with the magnetic field. And then the next thing we can do is we can look at the magnetic, the magnetic field lines. So to do that, we use the magnetic vector potential, AZ, which is derived from the perpendicular current, JZ. And what we do is we plot the magnetic vector potential as a function of time. And so this is what it looks like in a plane. And as you can see right here, there is, these are the 2 flux ropes. There's one here, and there's a smaller one right there. And then this cross is where the energy analyzer, energy analyzer is located at. So as you can see, this plane right here corresponds to this period of time at 13 milliseconds. As you can see, as time evolves, this red colored contour, we just colored them for to make it look to be able to so that it's much more clearer. You can see that the contours, they start, the field lines start to merge, and then you can see some sort of reconnection that's ongoing, right? And so this reconnection occurs when the magnetic field is at its maximum, and this occurs frequently. So there is frequent reconnection activity going on, and then these are correlated with the spikes that indicate the presence of the beam. Okay. So why is this important, right? So we look at the magnetic vector potential. We can take the magnetic vector potential, and then we look at minus dAz dt, which is the induced electric field. And then we notice that if we plot the induced electric field as a function in the plane, and then we note the position of the ion energy analyzer, we see that the ion energy analyzer is located at a position where the induced electric field is positive. So in a sense, we would think that this suggests that the induced electric field is created by magnetic reconnection, right? And this induced electric field is the one that's driving the beam, right? So this causes an acceleration and the beam gets produced. Okay, so this is experimental results. So now I would like to talk about some simulations. So this is a collaboration we did with Richard Soderov from the University of Alberta. So in this gyrokinetic simulation, we modeled the collision of the two flux ropes during the experiment. And so this is the magnetic vector potential of a cross section, right? And this is evolving in time. So you can see at the start, there's two flux ropes, and then they start to merge in the center. And then this is the magnetic vector potential that I showed previously in the previous slide. So what we did was, because in a simulation, you can track the particles, we looked at the particles at the center of the reconnection region, and then we tracked their velocities. And then when we tracked the velocities, we plotted them out in a three-dimensional particle distribution. So this is the result of what it looks like, Vx, Vy, and then Vz. There's three different colors right here. The red represents the ions that are accelerated. And from looking at this diagram, we can see that there is actually an ion beam that's being produced, right? So this simulation uses parameters that we use in our experiment, and then we saw an ion beam, and then this ion beam also happens to be in the plus Z direction. All right. And then if we look at the ratio of the velocities to the thermal velocities, so this Vz compared to the thermal velocity is about 5. So previously I showed that the ion beam is about 15 eV, that's about a ratio of 3. And so it's kind of off a little bit, but then this result looks very promising, and it sort of like solidifies like what we've seen in the experiment. Okay, so to summarize, we observed an ion beam that's aligned to the background magnetic field. This is highly correlated with the magnetic field and the rope oscillations, and we also saw that it moves in the direction of the induced electric fields. So all this evidence suggests that the ion beam is energized and is driven by magnetic reconnection. We have a three-dimensional gyrokinetic particle simulation that sort of shows the same results. And all of these results and the simulation data will be published in an upcoming paper. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Very interesting. I'm interested in this topic.
Mm-hmm.
How sure are you that it's really the electric field, paraelectric field that's driving these beams? And I'm asking this because it's really well known during reconnection, especially if you have a guide field of some sort, that it's the tension force in the out of plane direction that drive these beams. And if you look at the electric field, it's hard to imagine that the paraelectric field is driving the ions very strongly, because you know the electrons are going to be really accelerated if you have a paraelectric field. And so I'm just wondering if you've ruled out the possibility that there's a magnetic tension force out of the plane which actually drives the beams, because this is what we see in simulations all the time.
Yeah, okay, so to answer the question directly, no, we have not looked at the magnetic tension force, so that is something that we would consider. We are comparing, we are comparing the data to simulation at the moment, right? Just to be sure, because in simulation, so the thing is, for this experiment, data is kind of limited, and so what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at data, compare the simulation, and then from there we sort of try to make measurements and see if we can see other forces that are at work. So the magnetic tension force is something that we could definitely consider and take a look. Yeah, but for the electron distribution, so in the simulation, we also looked at the electron distribution function, right? That's those details we have to sort of iron it out, but we have the electron distribution function, and then we do see some, I believe we do see some acceleration, but I have to check with Rick Sudora on that. Yeah.